Today I'm going to be presenting on my project, A Lost Generation, How Government Policy Creates Systemic Barriers to Refugee Education in Turkey. So first off, I wanted to explain the title. This came from a quote we were told by one of our interviewees on my research trip to Istanbul. And he told us, "I worry about the ones who were 13 or 14 when the war broke out. Call them a lost generation." And you actually see this term, a lost generation, throughout the literature, news coverage on Syrian students who had to flee Syria during the Civil War. And basically, this generation, 13 or 14 when the war broke out, had extra challenges integrating into schools in new host countries, and sometimes weren't provided education services at all. So they're called a lost generation because they didn't have that chance to access education. And my project is focusing on both the ways that these barriers are created and also ways that we can get around those barriers and continue to provide education services for refugees. So to start out with, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about how I started this project. I was able to go on a research trip with Urban Refuge, which is an app that maps service providers for refugees. It was actually an app created by previous BU students. So I was able to join a research trip for that to interview service providers in Istanbul looking at supply side barriers for education services for refugees. And Istanbul actually makes a great case study for this problem because it has the largest population of refugees in any urban center in the world. And they have 3 million Syrians actually living in Turkey right now. So throughout our time in Istanbul, we were able to interview 7 NGOs who work with refugees. And these were interviews oriented towards the app that Urban Refuge has created. So we were asking a broad array of questions about the challenges they faced, and obviously I was focusing specifically on education. For a little policy background on what's happening in Turkey when it comes to education policy. Syrians, since they came to Turkey as refugees, they were educated in what's called temporary education centers. And these were set up, staffed mainly by Syrians who were teachers back in Syria. So they taught us curriculum that would have been similar to what students had in Syria, and they were taught in Arabic. Were provided for Syrians with what's called temporary protection status, which is essentially the legal status that registered Syrians have in Turkey, although there are a number of unregistered Syrians in Turkey as well who don't have this legal protection status. Then in 2016, Turkey had a failed coup attempt on the government. And after the coup attempt, you see all kinds of bids for expansion of power by the government. So things like shifting from a parliamentary to a presidential system, changes in or crackdowns on Syrians who aren't registered in Istanbul. They were either deported or moved to other cities in Turkey, and changes to the Turkish curriculum in public schools. And then what you see in 2017 is a program launched by the Turkish government in collaboration, funded by the EU, called the PIC test program. And what this program essentially does is it aimed to close all temporary education centers and move Syrians into Turkish public schools. And on paper, this sounds like a great idea. Basically, governments, NGOs like the UN, and the literature all agree that education is really critical in helping refugees integrate into host communities and to get jobs and be able to speak the language. It's really important. So on paper, a program aimed at integration should be a really great thing. But what we saw in practice when we were interviewing these NGOs is that the PIC test program also included a portion that made it so that private organizations like these NGOs couldn't provide any form of education services. So no tutoring, no language services, no additional classes to help students integrate. And this meant no classes for Syrians who are unregistered as well. So in 2019, we still see 50% of Syrian children in Turkey are enrolled in school, and only 33% high school age students are enrolled in school in Turkey. The puzzle that I wanted to look at after these interviews was what accounts for these systemic barriers to refugee education, these policies that limit the avenues that refugees can access education, despite the widespread consensus about education's importance for refugee integration. And in past explanations in the literature, people have looked at mismanaged information, limited state capacity, and language barriers, all as reasons why refugee groups might not be getting the services that the government policy has promised them. But I actually argue that in this case, we have to look at the political factors. A UNHCR report on refugee education said that education for refugees is inherently political. And I think that this is absolutely true in this case. What we see here is an increasingly authoritarian government following the coup attempt, interacting with a vulnerable group that are, in this case, refugees with a legally vulnerable status. And they're using policies, tools to extend control over these vulnerable groups when you have these two factors. And I found that that leads to limiting education policy, even when the goals of policy might be good, and even when everyone agrees that education policy is really important. So in interviewing our NGOs to look at this issue, one of the things that one of the NGOs told us is that we tried to look for an exception, but there is none. And this was referring to that limiting aspect of the PIC test program where NGOs couldn't provide education services. And she was talking about how refugees continued to come to her organization and find her organization looking for education services that they weren't able to provide anymore. And particularly unregistered Syrians who now couldn't access Turkish public schools and had now no other private avenues for accessing education. She said there was no exception for them. But we actually found that several organizations did manage to find loopholes to this policy. So where they had services before that were labeled things like education or preschool at the NGO level, those were now banned. So they often renamed those services things like workshops, trainings, or kid-friendly spaces. And this allowed them to continue to provide these education services despite the policy barriers in place. But obviously this isn't a perfect solution. It didn't allow them to continue all of their education programming, and it is still sort of a loophole. It's not a full avenue for these organizations to provide full-fledged services for Syrians. And part of the reason for this, I argue, is that the Syrian government that the Turkish government is trying to control the information given to Syrians in education because they moved Syrians into public education at the same time as they created these sort of nationalist curriculum changes in public education. And it allows the Turkish government to keep unregistered Syrians from accessing education because now they can't attend public schools and they're not getting these education services from private entities. The final solution that we found was a public-private partnership model. And the best example of this from the interviews that I was able to conduct in Istanbul was an organization called Multicilar in the Sultanbeyli municipality of Istanbul. And basically this was a collaboration between community-based NGOs and local governments. And I found that this kind of collaboration allows for nonprofits and governments alike to provide services that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. So this meant that Multicilar, an NGO, was able to provide education services despite these policy barriers because they were working in connection with a local government. So with a public actor. So this allowed them to continue to provide education programs for over 4,000 Syrians. They also provided education programs for other community members and refugee groups, which only improves integration between Syrians and the rest of the community. And this is also supported in the literature, which tells us that cross-sectoral collaborations produce clear policy benefits for disadvantaged immigrants. That was a case study done in San Francisco. So I think across the board, public-private partnership models are a great avenue for circumventing these limiting government policies, but ultimately we also have to continue to be critical of education policy by governments who are increasingly strict and cracking down on refugee groups. So thank you for watching my presentation, and I just want to thank my advisor and everyone at Kilachand for supporting me through this project. Thank you.